So, what would be a creative action that we could partake of if we recognise that we are the principal product of the commercial paradigm and that through being produced as such, we ensure our redundancy or our replacement? So, what I want to explore today is exactly that. In order for any potential creative action, a collective action, the context for this is the nature of the questions that ultimately that we're asking ourselves. So what front runs what I will term as the product return of the consumer is ultimately the questions that we're exploring when we're trying to understand what does it mean to be a consumer. So a consumer is not reducible to the agency that we're credited, but the claim that we acquit ourselves of. So I talk about this at length. So when time is given as a totalizing claim or as a value, you only see it marginally. You see it through the value associated with the time or the work-life balance and the way how you become an actuary of a system that's ultimately that you don't question. Because if you were to ask the question as whether or not your time is valuable, of course you would be repulsed at the suggestion that it is not. But that value is always in reference to what is transcendent to you. So we are sold not to see or sold to discount the questioning necessary to understand our existential status when we're given as that principal product. Okay, and so the conversation, so the first thing that you have to do is to engage people with the question. So essentially what I'm doing now. So the first, say, task for you guys is to ask people, what does it mean to be not what does it mean to be a consumer? You could ask that question, but then you say, how do we produce ourselves as a consumer? Ask that. That's the task. Your task is to do that. So if you ask this question, you ask it with other people, you're going to get an understanding that in the large part, the majority of people just literally have never asked that question. And so the more that you ask it, the more that you're going to engage a person with cognitive dissonance, or essentially what is outside the scope of conversation. Okay, so that is the prerequisite. So the more that you do that, the more that you are going to seed the conversation that ultimately the no ones, you being a no one, me being a no one, will own. Because it's the no ones of the world are the ones that create the world. We have to realize this. It's given to us. It's given to us. This is a creative task. So therefore we can say that is a prerequisite, is that those fundamental foundational questions that we explore. So the more that you do that, the more that you are animating or seeding that conversation, and it's going to disseminate. Why is that important? Well, ultimately it comes down to knowing where you are. And so therefore, why? Why is that important? Well, to know where you are is to know what is open to you to act beyond the pale or beyond what is accepted, okay? So we can say that this front runs any collective, say, creative actions that we could animate together. That's what it has to be. If we are dealing with that we are the principal product and there's only one way we produce ourselves, that means to say that there's only one way we unproduce ourselves. The nature of that unproduction or that creative enterprise is singular, but it's given in stages, because we have to look at that if we belong to commerce and people think that commerce has got to do with goods and services and not the principal product, you have to start with goods and services. All right. So what you're doing is that you are putting on notice the product return of the consumer, and through putting on notice, you're giving notice. You're giving notice that basically you're no longer going to be given as a demand center or a credit instrument. And this is the way that we orientate questioning beyond obviously the initial ones that we talk about and into the way how that you actually, that process of unproduction or the creative enterprise. So the creative enterprise is singular. There's only one enterprise that we're engaged with. It's the way how we unproduce ourselves, or the way how that we do justice to being born, to animate what is without origination. So that's ultimately what we are looking at. So to give notice, let's explore what that means when you give notice. Now, our frame of reference for giving notice is ultimately when we are employed. So we think that this fucking place sucks ass, and so we're saying, well, fuck you, I don't want to work here, so you give notice. So you're giving notice, but through giving notice, you're putting on notice ultimately that business. Maybe in some way that there's a cultural problem we could say within the business at large, or the systemic problems. And so, if you're looking at it from a business owner's perspective here, then they might see, okay, a person's, giving notice, but maybe there's something in our business that we keep on getting these people that we employ and then they always quit. So what is it about us as a destination for work? So you could say that the give notice puts on notice that there is an issue that's yet to be addressed, because they have to be receptive to the notices that people give in order for them to maybe rectify that, or at least start to see if there's something that needs to be addressed. Now, how do you relate that to when you're given as the principal product? You don't have a boss, do you? Of course you don't. So therefore, to give notice and to put on notice is to put on notice other people, is to give notice to other people as well. You're giving notice to each other. So if we're given as demand centres or the principal product of civilization, what you're doing is that you're giving notice and you're putting on notice that basically the credit instrument or demand centre that you're given as is no longer good enough, okay? So if it's no longer good enough, it means to say that you cannot vouchsafe our unfailing loyalty. All right, so that means, what does that mean? Well, that means to say that the way how the giving of notice has to be done artfully. So that's through the product return of the consumer. So the product return of the consumer is the initial, say, creative action that has its precursors in the conversation of the way how we produce ourselves as a consumer. So that's the way how that you take the conversation and then you disseminate it through creative means. So that can be through memes or any kind of creative art or way of using communication, all right, to then disseminate what is an off message. And it's off message because it's totally off in reference to the paradigm of commerce. Commerce, once again, is not reducible to the goods and services, but existential arbitrage of the principal trade. So to be off is to be totally off in reference to the commercial paradigm. Okay, so that off message is one message. So it might be disseminated in a multitude of different ways through memes and through whatever way is open to people to do so, but it's one message. It's one off message because it's totally off in reference to a paradigm. Commerce is singular, all right? The nature of what we're dealing with is singular. The singular nature of what we're dealing with, obviously, like I just reiterated, is the product that you're given as. So when you are orientating towards having a conversation that no one can own, and through giving notice and putting on notice, that off message is singular and is totally outside the way how that message can be made into a signal. The signal in this context relates to what? Well, how would, let's say, if you're looking at each other and the way how people would receive an off message when you're talking about the consumer or the demand center that you are and the way you produce yourself, think of that. You disseminate and it could be, like I said, it's totally open. There's no set rule for this thing. But what you're doing is that you're kind of engaging people with a question, ultimately, that they don't ask. But then there's other people in the paradigm that could look at these off messages and think, well, this is a signal in reference to something. This is a signal in reference to what? A movement? Like the product return of the consumer. Well, we think of what that means. How can a business, let's use the business as an example, turn that signal into a demand signal, so what it would be receptive to in order to monetize it. So when the product return of the consumer is disseminated, it's giving notice to put on notice that the way how that message would be interpreted is not the way how business is receptive to any kind of message or any conversation in the current paradigm. Why is that important? Well, you cannot monetize basically what is an impossible demand. It's an impossible demand in the sense that you're putting on notice the principal trade of existential arbitrage. So any business, let's say for instance, that was to see something like that and try to position themselves in reference to it, well, they're only trying to capitalize on what would be a creative enterprise to monetize the goodwill associated with it. But the issue of goodwill, and I'll explore this in a later episode, relates to the use of money or the use of a credit you are not the originator of, and ultimately the way how goodwill gets monetized to put on a balance sheet. So it's the way how that you have to animate goodwill off the balance sheet to potentialize the relationality of people and business. But the only way that you can do that is that you've got that off message finds a home within an ecosystem. So therefore what it does, does justice to the message. It's no longer a message of demand. It's ultimately saying, okay, these people, there is a command here and we have to be receptive to the command and align ourselves with the command to do justice to people. And that's ultimately what we need to explore. So just to reinforce what we talked about, you have to start to seed the conversation that no one will own by asking these questions that we explore, how we produce ourselves. Through doing that, you're creating that conversation that no one will own. That will give rise to the product return of the consumer that gives notice to put on notice the whole and commercial paradigm, and then we're orientated towards the way how that what would be a demand signal turns or morphs into a command signal, and the way how that we create basically the reception of that in an ecosystem that we all share. That's what we're basically dealing with when we're talking the practical application of what we explore when we understand that we're the principal product. Cheers.